There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that you later realize were the subtle turning of a lock, the quiet opening of a door into a room you never knew existed. For me, that moment smelled of old library books, rain-soaked asphalt, and the faint, clean scent of the laundry detergent Ethan used. It felt like the weight of his head on my shoulder, a solid, trusting pressure that seemed to anchor my entire world in place while simultaneously threatening to send it spinning off its axis. He was asleep, his breathing a soft, rhythmic tide against my collarbone, and the television was casting flickering blue light across his face, sculpting shadows under his cheekbones and catching in the dark sweep of his eyelashes. It was a Tuesday, just a regular Tuesday, but I knew, with the kind of gut-deep certainty that defies logic, that nothing would ever be ordinary again. This quiet, unasked-for intimacy was a new continent, and I was an explorer who had just washed ashore, terrified and exhilarated by the vast, uncharted wilderness ahead. It hadn't always been like this. For nearly a decade, my friendship with Ethan had been a study in stable architecture. It was a structure built on the solid bedrock of shared history, its walls defined by the clear, unspoken boundaries of platonic affection. We met on the high school swim team, a place of chlorine-scented chaos and the echoing shouts of our coach. Ethan was a force of nature, all kinetic energy and broad, easy smiles. He moved through the water like he was born in it, a powerful, fluid motion of muscle and grace that left the rest of us churning in his wake. He was the sun, drawing everyone into his orbit with an effortless gravity. I was not. I was quiet, a creature of the periphery. My domain was the careful observation from the edge of the pool, the analysis of light on the water's surface, the way a diver's form would break the perfect plane of reflection. I was a photographer even then, long before I ever owned a proper camera, collecting moments and storing them away like precious negatives. Our friendship formed in the spaces between the noise. In the quiet exhaustion of the locker room after practice, on the long bus rides to away meets where the drone of the engine lulled everyone else to sleep. We discovered a shared language that didn't require many words. He seemed to understand my silences, and I understood his need for them. He wasn't always the sun. Sometimes, especially after a disappointing race, he was just a boy with slumped shoulders who didn't want to talk about it, and I was the one person who never pushed him to. I would just sit with him, and that was enough. Our bond was forged in that comfortable quiet, a refuge from the pressures of competition and the social hierarchies of high school. We were teammates, and then we were friends, and the line between the two blurred so seamlessly that I never bothered to trace it. The moment my feelings shifted was as quiet and unassuming as the start of our friendship. It was the regional finals our senior year. Ethan had just won the 200-meter freestyle, shattering his personal best. He hoisted himself out of the pool in one fluid movement, water sluicing from his skin. The overhead fluorescent lights caught the droplets on his shoulders, turning them into a constellation of tiny, glittering stars. He shook his head, sending a spray of water arcing through the humid air, and then he looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd, the bleachers, his teammates. And then his gaze landed on me, standing by the starting blocks. He broke into a grin, a genuine, unforced smile of pure joy and relief, and it was aimed directly at me. In that split second, the architecture of our friendship trembled. A crack appeared in one of the load-bearing walls. It wasn't a seismic event, just a subtle shift, a hairline fracture, but I felt it deep in my bones. It was the realization that the quiet comfort I felt around him had, without my permission, deepened into something far more complex and dangerous. It was an ache, a yearning that I immediately recognized I would have to spend the rest of my life hiding. And I did. Through college, we went to different schools in the same state, close enough for occasional weekend visits. We navigated new friendships, stressful exams, and questionable life choices, but our own connection remained a constant, a reliable touchstone. He dated a girl named Sarah for 3 of those 4 years, a bright, bubbly art history major who seemed to perfectly complement his energy. I liked her genuinely. She made him happy, and his happiness was a landscape I enjoyed observing, even if I couldn't be at the center of it. I became an expert in the art of emotional compartmentalization. My feelings for Ethan were stored in a locked room in the back of my mind. Most of the time, I could ignore the door. I could pretend I didn't have the key. I focused on my photography, on learning to capture the world as I saw it, to find the beauty in overlooked details and quiet moments. My work became my sanctuary, a place where I could process the world without having to fully participate in it. After graduation, we both ended up back in the same city, a comfortable return to a familiar geography. I found a small studio apartment with great natural light and started a freelance career, shooting portraits, small events, anything that paid the bills. Ethan, with his computer science degree, landed a coveted job as a software engineer at a burgeoning tech company. He and Sarah moved into a trendy downtown loft, all exposed brick and industrial chic furniture. Our friendship settled into a new, adult rhythm. Weekly dinners, movie nights at my place because my couch was more comfortable, helping him assemble inscrutable pieces of flat-pack furniture. I photographed their Christmas card one year. I watched them build a life, a shared world, and I stood on the outside, the supportive friend, the quiet observer, meticulously reinforcing the walls of that locked room inside my head. The ache was still there, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of our interactions, but I had grown accustomed to it. It was just a part of my internal soundscape, like the faint tinnitus you learn to ignore. I had convinced myself that this was enough, that this carefully maintained distance was the only way to keep him in my life at all. To risk more was to risk everything, and the thought of his absence was a silence I knew I couldn't bear. The call came on a Thursday night in late October. The air had turned crisp, and the leaves on the trees outside my window were a riot of gold and crimson. I was in my makeshift darkroom, the red safe light casting an eerie glow over the chemical trays, watching an image of a rain-slicked street slowly materialize on a sheet of photographic paper. The process was meditative, a kind of magic I could control. My phone buzzed on the counter, vibrating against the metal. I almost ignored it, reluctant to break the spell, but a glance at the screen showed Ethan's name. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered, a casual "Hey, what's up?" on my lips. Leo. His voice was wrong. It was thin, hollowed out, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. All the usual warmth and resonance were gone, replaced by a brittle, ragged edge. My stomach clenched instantly. Ethan, are you okay? What's wrong? There was a long pause, filled with the sound of a shaky, indrawn breath. She's gone, he said, the two words cracking in the middle. Sarah. She left. She packed her things while I was at work. She's gone, the world outside my darkroom. The world of controlled magic and emerging images dissolved. There was only his voice, a thread of sound fraying at the ends. I didn't think. I just acted. Where are you? Home, he said, the words sounding like a question. At the loft, stay there. I'm coming over. I didn't wait for a reply. I hung up, switched off the safe light, and plunged the print into the stop bath, the movements automatic and disconnected from my conscious thought. 10 minutes later, I was navigating the city streets, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The vibrant autumn colors flashing past my windows seemed garish and mocking. When I arrived at his building, I found him sitting on the top step of the front stoop, staring at the sidewalk. He was wearing a thin hoodie despite the evening chill, his shoulders hunched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of his usual buoyant energy, as if the force that held him upright had simply evaporated. He looked up as I approached, and his eyes were wrecked. They were red-rimmed and vacant, lost in a landscape of shock and pain. He didn't say anything, just stood up and let me pull him into a hug. He felt stiff at first, then he just sagged against me, his head dropping onto my shoulder. I could feel a faint tremor running through his body. We stood there for a long time, the city's evening symphony of traffic and sirens playing around us, a world moving on, oblivious. I led him upstairs to the loft, the space he had shared with Sarah for 2 years. The change was immediate and brutal. It was a home that had been surgically altered. Gaps on the bookshelves, bare hooks on the walls where paintings used to hang, an unnerving amount of empty space in the closet. The very air in the apartment felt thin, stripped of the energy and life that had once filled it. It was an architectural ghost, haunted by the negative space of a person who was no longer there. Ethan drifted through the rooms like a phantom, his movements aimless and disconnected. He would pick something up, a coffee mug, a stray book, and stare at it for a moment before setting it down again, as if he couldn't remember its purpose. I didn't know what to do, what to say. There are no words for that kind of sudden emptiness. So I fell back on what I knew, quiet presence. I made coffee, even though I doubted he would drink it. I tidied the kitchen, putting away dishes and wiping down counters, a small act of imposing order on the chaos. He eventually settled on the couch, curling into one corner, his knees drawn up to his chest. I brought him a mug of coffee and sat on the opposite end, leaving a wide, respectful chasm of space between us. We sat in silence for what felt like hours as the light outside faded from gray to a deep, inky black. The city lights began to glitter in the massive loft windows. He finally spoke, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet. She left a note. Said she hasn't been happy for a long time. A long time, Leo. How do you live with someone for 2 years and not know they're not happy? I didn't have an answer. I just listened as he talked, the words coming in fits and starts. He wasn't crying, not yet. He was in that strange, numb space of pure shock, the mind's self-protective mechanism against a pain too large to process all at once. As the night wore on, his energy finally gave out. His words slurred with exhaustion. His head began to nod. You need to sleep, I said softly. He shook his head. I can't. Not in there. He gestured vaguely toward the bedroom, a room now half empty and wholly haunted. Then sleep out here, I said. On the couch, he looked at the couch, then at me, and a flicker of something. Fear, loneliness, a desperate plea, crossed his face. It was a fleeting, vulnerable expression I had never seen from him before. He shifted slightly, closing a few inches of the gap between us. It was a barely perceptible movement, but in the charged silence of that room, it felt like a tectonic shift. It was the first tremor, the first sign that the ground beneath our long-established friendship was becoming unstable. He didn't ask for anything, not with words. But his proximity was a question, a test. And I answered by staying perfectly still, by becoming an anchor in his storm, even as my own heart began to pound a frantic, hopeful, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. That night, he fell into a fitful sleep on one end of the couch, and I stayed on the other, a silent sentinel in the ruins of his life, acutely aware that something had irrevocably changed. The clear, solid walls of our friendship had begun to dissolve. That night was the beginning of the ritual. It began out of necessity, a temporary solution to a crisis. Ethan couldn't stand to be in his own apartment, a space that echoed with absence. So he started spending his evenings at my place. My small, quiet apartment became his sanctuary. It was unassuming, filled with stacks of books, framed photographs, and the scent of coffee and developing chemicals. It was a space that held no memories of Sarah, no ghosts in the hallways. It was neutral territory. At first, he would just come for dinner. I'd cook something simple, and we would eat, often in a comfortable silence punctuated by his sporadic, fragmented thoughts about the breakup. He was sorting through the emotional wreckage, and I was just there, a witness to the process. The first time it happened, it felt like an accident. We were on my couch, a worn but comfortable thing I'd bought secondhand, watching some mindless action movie I'd put on for distraction. The hero was defusing a bomb against a ticking clock, but I was barely paying attention. I was hyper-aware of Ethan beside me, of the way his energy, even depleted, seemed to fill the small space. He was leaning back against the cushions, his eyes glazed over with exhaustion. Halfway through the movie, I felt a subtle shift in weight. I glanced over and saw that his head had started to list to one side, his eyes closed. A moment later, his head came to rest gently against my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending fired at once. I could feel the texture of his hoodie against my neck, the warmth of him seeping through my t-shirt, the soft puff of his breath against my skin. My own breathing hitched. I was frozen, trapped between the desperate urge to lean into the contact and the terrified instinct to pull away. It was a test of my years of practice, of my mastery of self-control. I stared at the television screen, my eyes unseeing, my mind a deafening roar of panic and a fragile, treacherous hope. He was just tired, I told myself. He was emotionally shattered. This meant nothing. It was a purely functional act of a body seeking the nearest point of stability. I repeated this mantra over and over, a desperate incantation to ward off the true, dangerous meaning my heart was trying to ascribe to the gesture. He slept like that for the rest of the movie, and I didn't move a single muscle, afraid that the slightest motion would break the spell, that he would wake up, realize the accidental intimacy, and retreat in embarrassment. When the credits rolled, I sat in the darkness for a long time before gently shaking him awake. He blinked, disoriented, and pulled away quickly, a mumbled apology on his lips. Sorry, man. I was out. He didn't seem to register the significance of where he had been sleeping. For him, it was an accident. For me, it was a revelation. A few nights later, the accident became a precedent. We were on the couch again. This time, he didn't even pretend to be watching the movie. He just sighed, a long, weary sound, and leaned his head against my shoulder deliberately. There was no pretense of sleep, no accidental drift. It was a choice. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Is this okay? He murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion. The question hung in the air between us, shimmering with unspoken possibilities. He was asking for permission, acknowledging the shift, the blurring of the line. I could have said no. I could have reinforced the boundary, reminded him of the platonic architecture of our friendship. It would have been the safe, sensible thing to do. But I was tired of being sensible. I was tired of the locked room and the carefully guarded key. Yeah, I heard myself say, my own voice sounding distant and unsteady. It's okay. He let out a small sigh of relief and seemed to settle more fully against me, the tension draining from his shoulders. And so the ritual was born. It became our new normal. 3 or 4 nights a week, he would come over. We would eat, we would talk, and then we would migrate to the couch, and he would lean on me. Sometimes he would talk, his voice a low rumble against my chest, as he worked through his grief and confusion. More often, he would just be quiet, his presence a heavy, comforting weight. I became a student of this new, silent language. I learned the subtle variations in the pressure of his head against my shoulder, the difference between the exhausted weight of a man running on fumes and the softer, more settled weight of a man finding a moment of peace. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, transformed. It became a shared space, a vessel for our strange, evolving intimacy. His presence began to permeate the air, to seep into the very fabric of the place. A stray hoodie left on a chair, a different brand of coffee in my cupboard because he'd picked it up on his way over, the lingering scent of his shampoo on the couch cushions. My life, which had been a series of carefully composed still lives, was suddenly filled with the unpredictable motion of another person. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. Each night was an exercise in exquisite torture. I would sit there, a living anchor for him, while my own emotions were a churning sea within me. Every instinct screamed at me to react, to put my arm around him, to run my fingers through his hair, to turn my head and close the infinitesimal distance between our faces. But I did none of those things. I remained perfectly still, a statue of platonic support, because I was convinced that was the price of admission. My role was to be the safe harbor, the unmoving, unthreatening friend. To ask for more, to show him the truth of my own yearning, felt like it would be a betrayal of his trust. He was coming to me for comfort, not for the messy complications of my long-hidden feelings. So I held my breath and played my part, absorbing his pain and loneliness while meticulously hiding my own. I started to think of it in photographic terms. I was living in a state of prolonged exposure. The shutter of my heart was wide open, letting in all this light, all this proximity, all this warmth from him. I was capturing every detail. The way his breathing would deepen as he drifted off to sleep, the occasional twitch of his fingers against the cushion next to my leg, the soft, vulnerable curve of his neck. I was creating a detailed, intimate portrait of him in my mind, but I knew that too much light, one wrong move, could overexpose the entire image, blowing out the highlights and plunging the shadows into an indecipherable black. I was capturing something incredibly precious and fragile, and I was terrified of destroying it in the process. The ritual was a beautiful, dangerous dance on a knife's edge, and every night, I willingly stepped onto the blade, praying I wouldn't fall. The silence between us was no longer just comfortable. It was laden with a heavy, unspoken tension, a space filled with all the things we weren't saying. And the longer it went on, the more I began to wonder if I was the only one who felt it. The night the ritual broke, the air was thick with the promise of a storm. Rain had been threatening all day, and a heavy, humid stillness had settled over the city. We were on the couch, side by side, the television murmuring in the background. It was a quiet night. Ethan hadn't talked much, but the quality of his silence had changed over the past few weeks. The raw, ragged edge of his grief had softened, replaced by a more contemplative quiet. He was still leaning against me, a familiar, comforting weight, but he wasn't asleep. I could feel the subtle tension in his frame, the focused stillness of someone who was not relaxed but deeply pensive. The movie ended, and the screen went black, plunging the room into a deeper darkness, broken only by the ambient glow of the city lights through the window. Neither of us moved. The silence stretched, no longer comfortable or sleepy, but charged, electric. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a lightning strike. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart, the sound of the rain finally beginning to tap against the window pane. I felt him shift, not away from me, but towards me. He lifted his head from my shoulder and turned, his body angling to face mine in the small space on the couch. I could just make out the shape of his face in the dim light, his expression unreadable. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. It was the first word either of us had spoken in over an hour. "Yeah." My voice was tight, strangled. I had a sudden, overwhelming feeling that we were standing at the edge of a precipice. He hesitated, and I could hear him draw a breath. "Can I ask you something stupid?" My entire universe contracted to the space between us, to the sound of his breathing and the rain on the glass. Every self-preservation instinct I had honed over the last decade was screaming at me to deflect, to make a joke, to turn on a light and break the spell. But I was done with self-preservation. I was done with the locked room. "You can ask me anything," I said, the words feeling momentous, like a vow. He looked down for a second, at his hands resting on the cushion between us, and then his eyes met mine again in the darkness. The vulnerability in his gaze was a physical blow. "Would it be okay," he began, his voice barely audible over the rain, "if I kissed you?" Time stopped. The rain, the city, the air in my lungs, it all ceased to exist. There was only his question, hanging in the space between us. It wasn't a proposition, or a joke, or a line. It was a plea. It was a question born of a terrifying uncertainty, of fragile hope. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. My mind, usually a frantic catalog of anxieties and analyses, went completely silent. All the years of pining, of carefully constructed walls, of quiet observation from a safe distance, all of it crumbled to dust in the face of that one, simple question. He was giving me a choice. He was laying his own confusion and burgeoning feelings at my feet and trusting me not to crush them. He was handing me the power to either shatter this moment forever or to meet him on that terrifying precipice. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't have spoken if I'd tried. Instead, I leaned forward, closing the final few inches between us. It was my answer. His eyes fluttered shut, and then his lips met mine. The kiss was nothing like I had ever imagined. It wasn't a desperate, passionate collision. It was soft, tentative, achingly gentle. It was a question in itself, asking for confirmation, for reassurance. It was hesitant and searching, a quiet exploration in the dark. It tasted of rain and salt and a profound, unspoken loneliness that I recognized because it mirrored my own. I brought my hand up to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking his cheek, and I felt a tremor run through him at the contact. He leaned into my touch, a small, grateful sound escaping his throat. When we finally broke apart, we didn't move away. Our foreheads rested together, our breath mingling in the small, sacred space we had just created. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It wasn't empty or tense. It was full. It was a silence of shared understanding, of a line crossed together. The architecture of our friendship hadn't just been altered. It had been demolished, and in its place, we had just laid the foundation for something new, something terrifying and beautiful and utterly unknown. In the dim light, I could see his eyes again, and they were shining with a mixture of fear and relief. He had jumped, and I had caught him. Or maybe we had just jumped together. The rain fell harder against the window, a cleansing sound, washing the world clean, and for the first time in a very long time, the ache in my chest was gone, replaced by the quiet, thunderous beat of a hope that was finally, terrifyingly, real. The morning after was disarmingly quiet. I woke up alone. For a dizzying, heart-stopping moment, I thought I had dreamed it all, that the storm and the confession and the impossible softness of his lips had been a figment of my sleep-addled imagination. But then I saw it, a note on a folded piece of paper on the coffee table. My name, written in his familiar, slightly messy script. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was short, brutally so. Had to get to work early. Thanks for last night. Talk soon. Talk soon. The two most ambiguous words in the English language. They were a shield, a delay tactic, a promise with no deadline. The warmth that had filled my chest the night before began to cool, replaced by a creeping, familiar dread. I spent the day in a state of suspended animation. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar ritual of my darkroom, but my hands were unsteady, my focus shot. Every image I tried to develop seemed to come out blurry, indistinct, as if the world itself had lost its sharp edges. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed. Had I been too eager? Had I misinterpreted his intent? Was it just a moment of profound loneliness, a desperate reach for human connection in the wake of his grief, a gesture he now profoundly regretted? The talk soon stretched from hours into a full day, and then two. My phone remained silent. The lack of communication was a gaping wound. Our ritual, the constant, comforting presence of his texts and calls, had been severed. The silence he left in his wake was louder and more painful than any argument could have been. He was avoiding me. The realization landed like a stone in my stomach. He had stepped across the line, seen what was on the other side, and had immediately retreated in panic. And I had let him. I had let myself believe that a single, tentative kiss could dismantle a decade of carefully constructed boundaries. The anxiety began to curdle into a dull, throbbing hurt. I felt foolish, exposed. I had opened the locked room, and the first person I had shown it to had turned and walked away. On the third day of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The ambiguity was eating me alive. I knew I had to be the one to break it. Waiting for him to come to me felt like a form of self-torture. So I drove to his apartment, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I didn't have a plan. I just knew that I couldn't live inside the suffocating question mark he had left behind. He opened the door after the second knock. He looked terrible. His hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked surprised to see me, and then a wave of something, guilt, anxiety, regret, washed over his face. He didn't invite me in, just stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. "Hey," he said, his voice low and rough. "Hey," I replied, my own voice surprisingly steady. "You said we'd talk." He winced and ran a hand through his hair. "Leo, I'm sorry. I've been a mess. I get that you're a mess, Ethan," I said, and the frustration I'd been suppressing finally started to leak into my tone. What I don't get is the silent treatment. What I don't get is what happened. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at a spot on the floor just past my shoulder. "It shouldn't have happened," he mumbled. "It was a mistake. I was lonely. I was confused. I used you." I'm sorry. Every word was a small, sharp blade. A mistake. Used you. The clinical, dismissive language was designed to cauterize the moment, to deny its intimacy, to reduce it to a symptom of his own pain. The hurt was so sharp it almost stole my breath, but beneath it, something else flared. Anger. Not just at him, but at myself, for being willing to accept the narrative he was so desperately trying to create. Don't do that, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Don't you dare hide behind that excuse. I've been your friend for 10 years. I know when you're lonely. I know when you're confused. That night, that was something else. And you know it. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a desperate, cornered panic. What do you want me to say, Leo? He asked, his voice rising. That I'm not the person I thought I was? That my whole life feels like it's been turned upside down? I just got out of a 2-year relationship. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I shot back, my own control finally snapping. I'm just asking you not to treat me like a mistake. I'm asking you to be honest. Was any of it real? Or was I just a convenient shoulder to cry on, and then to kiss, when you felt lost? The question hung between us, raw and ugly. He looked away again, his jaw tight. The silence stretched, and in it, I got my answer. His inability to deny it was a confession in itself. He couldn't lie, not to me, but the truth was too terrifying for him to articulate. He was a man adrift, clinging to the wreckage of his old life, and he was terrified of the new shore he'd washed up on. I felt a profound, weary sadness settle over me. I can't do this, Ethan, I said softly, the anger draining away, leaving only exhaustion in its place. I can't live in your confusion. It's not fair. So you figure it out. You figure out what you want. But don't come to my apartment for shelter from your storm if you're just going to leave wreckage in your wake. I turned and walked away, not waiting for a response. Every step felt like walking on broken glass. I had forced the confrontation. I had demanded honesty. And the result was this: a deeper, more painful silence. I had crossed the line from a quiet, yearning friend to a complicated, demanding problem he didn't know how to solve. I drove home, the city lights blurring through the tears I refused to let fall. I had opened the door, and he had slammed it shut, leaving us both on opposite sides of a wall that now seemed higher and more impenetrable than ever before. The aftermath was worse than the waiting. It was a cold, hard certainty of loss. The week that followed our confrontation was the longest of my life. The silence from Ethan was no longer an ambiguous void. It was a definitive statement. It was a solid wall, and I had no idea what was happening on the other side. My apartment, once a shared sanctuary, felt cavernous and cold. Every corner seemed to hold a memory of him. The indent on the couch cushion where he always sat, the ghost of his warmth, the echo of his quiet breathing. I tried to reclaim the space, to fill it with my own presence. I worked relentlessly, spending long hours in the darkroom, focusing on the tangible, chemical process of creation. I sought refuge in the control it offered, the predictable magic of bringing an image to life. But even there, he followed me. I found myself looking at my own photographs, at the way I framed the world, and seeing him in everything. In the stark loneliness of a single tree against a winter sky. In the fragile intimacy of two shadows stretching to meet on a city street. I mourned the loss of our friendship more than the loss of a potential romance. The kiss had been a fleeting moment, a spark in the dark, but our friendship had been a decade-long constant, a steady flame. I had gambled with it, pushed for a truth he wasn't ready to face, and I had lost. The ache in my chest returned, deeper and more persistent than before. It was the hollow feeling of a foundational part of my life having been excavated, leaving nothing but an empty pit. I cycled through waves of anger, hurt, and a deep, weary sadness. I was angry at his cowardice, hurt by his dismissal, and sad for the easy, uncomplicated bond we had shared and would likely never have again. Then, one evening, 10 days after I had walked away from his doorstep, there was a knock on my door. It was late, well after 10, and the sound was so unexpected it made me jump. My heart began to pound a familiar, frantic rhythm. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked to the door, my mind racing. I peered through the peephole, and my breath caught in my throat. It was Ethan. He was just standing there in the hallway, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders hunched in that familiar way. He looked tired, but the frantic, cornered panic in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, solemn resolution. I took a deep breath and opened the door. We stood there for a moment, the silence of the hallway stretching between us. He was the one to break it. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet. I hesitated for only a second before stepping aside and letting him pass. He walked into the living room and stood in the center, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. He finally turned to face me. "You were right," he said, his voice raw with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I was a coward, and I was unfair to you. I'm sorry." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. I wasn't ready to make it easy for him. "What do you want, Ethan?" He took a step closer, his gaze steady and direct. "I want to be honest," he said. "With you and with myself. That night, it wasn't a mistake, and I wasn't using you. I was terrified, because it felt more real than almost anything I'd felt with Sarah for the last year. And that scared the hell out of me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My entire life, I've had a map. High school, college, get a good job, meet a girl, build a life. It was all laid out, and I was following it. But I think, for a long time, I was just going through the motions. I was comfortable, but I wasn't present. When Sarah left, the map was gone. I was completely lost. And the only person I wanted to see, the only person I felt safe with, was you. It's always been you, Leo." He let out a shaky breath. "Coming here, sitting on this couch with you. It wasn't just about being sad about Sarah. It was the first time in months, maybe years, that I felt like I could just be. I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to be the happy, energetic guy everyone expects. I could just be quiet. With you. And that feeling, it started to become more important than anything else." He looked down at his feet, then back up at me, his eyes shining. "The kiss. I wanted to kiss you. It wasn't about loneliness. It was about you. And when it happened, it was like a light switched on in a room I didn't even know was dark. And I panicked, because it meant the map was wrong. It meant I was wrong about who I was. And instead of dealing with it, I ran. I tried to turn off the light and pretend the room didn't exist. And I hurt you in the process. And I am so sorry for that." I listened to his confession, my own carefully constructed walls of anger and hurt beginning to crumble with every word. He wasn't making excuses. He was offering an explanation. He was showing me the tangled, messy, terrified truth of his own heart. The relief that washed over me was so profound it almost made my knees buckle. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. "I don't know what this is," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I don't know what we are or what we're supposed to do. All I know is that the last 10 days without you have been worse than the day Sarah left. The silence. I can't live in that silence, Leo. I don't want to." I finally uncrossed my arms and pushed myself off the doorframe. I walked toward him until I was standing just a foot away. "I don't want to live in it either," I said, my voice soft. We stood there, in the quiet of my living room, the space that had been our sanctuary, then a place of conflict, and was now, hopefully, a place of healing. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. There was just a shared, fragile honesty. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. We were both lost, in our own ways, but for the first time, it felt like we might be able to find our way forward together. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed against mine. It was a question, just like his kiss had been. I answered by turning my hand over and lacing my fingers through his. His hand was warm, solid, real. He squeezed my hand. A small, grateful gesture, and a tentative smile touched his lips. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in weeks, and it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long, relentless storm. We didn't talk much more that night. The words had been said. Now, it was time for a new kind of quiet, one built not on hidden feelings or fearful uncertainty, but on a shared, acknowledged truth. We ended up on the couch, side by side, our hands still clasped together on the cushion between us. After a while, he leaned his head on my shoulder, just as he had done so many times before. But this time, everything was different. There was no pretense, no plausible deniability. It was an intentional act of closeness, of choosing to be here, with me. I relaxed and leaned my own head against his. I was no longer a statue, a fixed point of support. I was a participant. I was half of a whole. We eventually moved to my bedroom, a space he had never been in before. It was a simple, unspoken decision. There was no pressure, no expectation. He just followed me, and I pulled back the covers, and we climbed in. We lay facing each other in the dark, the faint city lights filtering through the blinds, casting stripes across the room. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his touch gentle, reverent. "Is this okay?" he whispered, echoing the words he had said on the couch weeks ago, the words that had started it all. I smiled in the darkness. "Yeah," I whispered back. "It's okay." He moved closer, wrapping an arm around my waist and pulling me against his chest. I rested my head in the crook of his neck, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of him. His heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm against my ear. For the first time, we were sleeping together without pretext, without a crisis to justify it. It was simply a choice to not be apart. In the quiet darkness of my room, surrounded by his warmth, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The long, churning storm inside me had finally passed. The sea was calm. We had found our harbor. In the beginning, we learned to build a new language together, one that existed in the spaces between words. Our new normal was a quiet, domestic tapestry woven from small, intentional acts. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom without asking, a silent declaration of his intent to stay. It was in the way I started buying his brand of coffee, an unspoken acknowledgement that my kitchen was now our kitchen. We moved slowly, cautiously, as if handling something infinitely precious and fragile. We were learning the rhythms of each other in this new context, mapping the uncharted territory of US. The couch was still our place, but its meaning had transformed. The ritual of him leaning on me was no longer a source of anxious analysis for me or a subconscious plea for comfort for him. It was simply how we fit together. It was a conscious act of affection, an easy, settled intimacy. Sometimes, I would be reading, and he would come and rest his head in my lap, closing his eyes as I absent-mindedly ran my fingers through his hair. There was no tension, no unspoken questions, just a deep, abiding sense of rightness. The ghost of his grief for Sarah faded, not because it was forgotten, but because it was integrated into the person he was now, a part of the history that had, in its own complicated way, led him to me. One Saturday afternoon, a few months into our new beginning, he was helping me in my darkroom. He had become fascinated by the process, by the alchemy of it all. He stood beside me in the dim, red glow, watching as I gently agitated a tray of developer, waiting for an image to emerge. It was a portrait I had taken of him a few days earlier, one he hadn't known I'd captured. He had been sitting on the windowsill of my apartment, looking out at the rain, a thoughtful, peaceful expression on his face. As his likeness slowly bloomed on the paper, a ghostly image firming into reality, he was silent. I watched his face, illuminated by the safe light. He was seeing himself through my eyes, seeing the quiet adoration and gentle focus with which I saw him. "Is that really what I look like?" he asked, his voice hushed with a kind of wonder. "That's what I see," I replied softly. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, our skin slick with the faint scent of chemicals. In the quiet hum of the darkroom, surrounded by the ghosts of captured moments, we were creating a new one, a tangible image of our shared present. It felt symbolic, like we were developing our own future, slowly, carefully, letting it emerge from the darkness in its own time, unafraid of the light. You spend your life building rooms inside yourself. Rooms for your hopes, your fears, your past. And some rooms you keep locked, convinced they are too strange or too fragile to ever show anyone. You learn to live around them, to navigate the hallways of your own heart with a careful, practiced solitude. Ethan and I had both been living in our own separate houses, filled with locked doors and quiet, lonely corridors. What we discovered was that love isn't about one person moving into the other's house. It's about finding that you both hold the key to the same room, a room you never knew you were building for someone else. It's about stepping inside, together, and finally feeling like you're home. We didn't need a map anymore. We had each other, a compass pointing not to a pre-drawn destination, but toward a shared horizon. And we began to walk toward it, slowly, hand in hand, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.